guys, so I'm here today to do my top 15 books of 2015. Now I had no intention of doing 15 books in this video because it felt like quite a lot, and where do you end it? I don't want to do 20 books in 2020. So I had decided just to do an arbitrary number, pick out the books that I loved the most this year and just really wanted to recommend to you. Thought most of you should read if you haven't already and have really stuck with me this year. And I ended up with 15, so honestly was completely by mistake, but here we are. So let's just jump straight into it. These books are in no particular order. I adored them all, and if I have done reviews of any of them, I'll link them down below, but I'll try and make sure to tell you exactly why these books really stuck with me and I think you should read them in this video. The first one on my pile is A Portable Shelter by Kirsty Logan. I hadn't read any Kirsty Logan before this book. She is the author of The Grace Keepers, which has been quite a popular book this year, and this is a collection of her short stories that came out this year as well. The paperback will be coming out next year, so if you can't get your hands on this copy then it won't be long to wait, but this is beautiful. Outside and inside. There are 13 stories and they're all based on classic Scottish folklore, Kirsty Logan being a Scottish author and this book being set in Scotland. The premise is that a pregnant couple, two women, are telling their unborn child stories whilst it's in the womb, taking turns, and they say that they won't tell their baby any lies, they'll only tell it facts. But when, say, the pregnant one's asleep or the non-pregnant one's at work, they're telling their child fairy tales. I think part of the point is that there is truth in these fairy tales, maybe not the exact events happen, but the messages. Just absolutely stunning. I zoomed through this one in 2 sittings. I would have done it in 1 if I hadn't had other things to do that day. I just think it was beautiful. I think her prose is beautiful and I just loved each story. Honestly, I feel like I should be more articulate and have more to say in this video, but I just loved this book. Now next is a classic, and it is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This is my first and only Jane Austen to date. Loved it. If you haven't read any Jane Austen yet, I would highly recommend starting with this one. I really enjoyed it. It's a kind of parody of the gothic novel genre, which I haven't read a terrible amount of, but I have since started The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is a gothic novel that the characters talk about in this book, and I'm really enjoying it. And they're over the top in camp, these gothic novels, and mysterious, and this book really kind of takes a mickey of that. It's about a young girl who's obsessed with reading gothic literature and wants to lead a very exciting life, and kind of realises by the end how ridiculous that is, and it is set in the 1800s, so would highly recommend. It is very tongue-in-cheek and good fun and good romance in there. Now certainly a much less romantic book is my next choice, and that is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. This is a translated novel, translated from the original Korean, and the author herself South Korean, and the book is set in South Korea. I have never read a book set in South Korea before, so this was very exciting for me and I was not disappointed. It is about a woman who's essentially going mad, and this first manifests itself in her becoming a vegetarian, which, although uncommon in South Korea, is not what is strange in itself. She started having these nightmares about meat, and that's kind of what's led to this vegetarianism, and it's not led to a healthy vegetarian lifestyle. It's coming from a mentally ill part of her brain, and the people around her are just so confused and everyone handles it very differently. Her husband just basically cannot be bothered. He clearly only sees her as a housekeeper and is really not willing to put up with this mental breakdown. Her brother-in-law decides to sexually fetishize her and becomes obsessed with her and definitely uses her and takes advantage of her in this state, and her sister is just purely incredibly worried about her and is trying to figure out what to do. And the book's very much about madness and how close we are all to madness and what makes a person mad, and it is just incredible. I then have another collection of short stories, and this one is a Russian collection translated into English, and it's Lyudmila Petruskaya's There Once Lived a Woman Who Tried to Kill Her Neighbour's Baby, Scary Fairy Tales, and these are all short stories set in Russia over different periods of time with kind of fairy tale elements to them. At least they have that kind of fantastical, gruesome themes that traditional fairy tales have, although set in like ordinary situations, but sometimes with kind of magical themes. They're very gruesome, very much like the adult short stories of Roald Dahl, I felt, and I just loved this collection and have since picked up another one of her collections and cannot wait to read it. We then have a play. Lots of different formats here, which is good, and that is Ali Smith's The Seer. I adored this book. Jen gifted this to me and I'm so glad she did. I just instantly took to it. It's a comical play set in Scotland, and it follows a couple who lead a very unexciting life. They do the same thing every single day, and one night the woman's sister comes chapping at their door and they invite her in, despite the fact that they know this woman is not Iona's sister but an imposter. But because their life's so dull, particularly Iona is willing to embrace this new set of circumstances. It also very much deals with the relationship between Scotland and England, trying to break down the negativity there subtly, but it's also just a really comical play and I really, really enjoyed it. There's a lot of crossing the fourth wall in it. And then we have Tom Holt's The Portable Door. A bit of a change from the rest of them. This one's a comical fantasy book set in London, where our main character, Paul Carpenter, gets a job at a mysterious firm in London as a clerk. He doesn't really know what they do. Turns out they're run by goblins and fairies and giants, and they deal with kind of magical clients, and Paul himself has a knack for wizardry. It is hilarious. If you like comic fantasy or comedy books, then this is a must read for you. I adored this. It is the first in a 3-part series about Paul. The second 2 certainly don't live up to the same standard as the first one, but the first one is very much readable as a standalone if you don't want to read the other 2, although the other 2 are good fun, and I wouldn't say don't read them, but they're definitely not the same level as this one. This one was perfection in my mind. I could not put it down. I was laughing out loud. Adored it. We then have another play, but this one is an ancient play, but still a comedy. Been enjoying my comedy this year. And it's one of the plays from this collection, which is Aristophanes' Birds and Other Plays, and the particular play I want to talk about is Lysistrata. Cannot believe it took me this long to read Lysistrata. It is a very famous Greek comedy. It is set during the Peloponnesian War between different Greek city-states, and it's set in Athens. And basically the Athenian wives decide they are sick of this war and they want peace, and the way they decide to go about this is to refuse the men of the city sex. They decide to withhold sex. They all congregate together on the Acropolis, which is the religious centre in Athens, and refuse their husband's sex in order until they end the war. It's absolutely hilarious. It's a really interesting look into some ancient Greek psychology there. Just loved it. So funny, so interesting. Not at all something that actually happened, but really, really interesting as what it says about antiquity and kind of relevant to my studies. But also a piece of ancient literature that I think any of you could start with. I think you would enjoy it. The book I'm sure you've all been waiting for in this video, as it was undoubtedly going to turn up, and that is John Burnside's The Dumb House. If you have yet to be Burnsided this year, then make 2016 the year that you will be Burnsided by The Dumb House. This is a new release of John Burnside's first ever novel, The Dumb House, in a gorgeous vintage modern classics edition with the red spine there. And this is about a man who's obsessed with speech and the soul, the innateness of speech, the relationship between speech and the soul and language, and if there is an original language. Based on some stories his mother told him as a child. He's also clearly a sociopath, and the way he treats women is atrocious. There's some very violent scenes in this, and he also chooses to conduct experiments on his own 2 children, who he never ever speaks to and never exposes to speech, in the hopes that he will discover the original language. He is absolutely insane, but this book is so gruesome, disturbing, beautifully written, and just a must read. I loved it. Like, I absolutely loved it. It really disturbed me. It was really unnerving, but I could not put it down. Would highly recommend. We then have a book based on ancient myths, and that is Jeanette Winterson's Wait. Jeanette Winterson is another author I had never read before this year, but I have quickly corrected this faux pas. I am working my way through her works now. I absolutely love them, and this was my favourite. Also just one of my favourite books of the year. This is based on the myth of Atlas. It's from the Canongate Myth series, which is a series of books Canongate published a while back, written by different authors, each retelling their favourite myth. and Jeanette Winterson chose to retell the myth of Atlas and what happens between Atlas and Heracles when Atlas kind of gets his day off from holding the weight of the world on his shoulders, as that was his punishment after the war between the Titans and the gods, where the Titans lost. Atlas being a Titan, he then had to hold up the weight of the world. One of my favourite things about this book, it's quite actually an emotional book in parts, but was the portrayal of Hercules. The characterization of Hercules as basically a misogynistic prick was just so accurate. It's like exactly what Hercules is like in the ancient myths, just told in a modern style. Loved it, absolutely loved it. I still think Hercules is possibly the biggest dick of antiquity. There's no other way to phrase that, sorry. But I think Jeanette Winterson got it spot on. We then have Tooth and Claw by Jo Walton. This is a high fantasy novel where essentially all the characters are dragons. It is, as the title, as the quote on the front says, the pride and prejudice of the dragon world. It is very much a Trollope or Jane Austen novel transposed into a world where all the characters are dragons, which sounds absurd, but it works perfectly. Jo Walton has just done this spot on. She manages to adhere to that kind of Trollope style storyline and book and characterization, but without making it seem unnatural. In a dragon world, she adapts it to these dragons, and yeah, it's set in a world purely of dragons, where there is like family intrigue and inheritance issues and class issues, etc, etc, but all the characters are dragons. I don't know how to explain it other than that. I feel like if you like books set in the 1800s and you like fantasy and you like dragons, then you will love this book. It was just perfection. And I just want more books like this. I feel like Jo Walton should write a whole series of books set in this world, and I would be such a happy chappy. I then have a non-fiction book to talk to you about, and that is The Honour Code by Kwame Anthony Appiah. How moral revolutions happen. I have on very few occasions enjoyed a non-fiction book from cover to cover and sped through it at the speed I sped through this book. It is definitely up there with my top non-fiction books for everybody to read, rather than just a reference book, but an enjoyable read. And it basically deals with honour codes in different societies. Honour codes is something that all societies have and change throughout history. It takes 3 different societies, so the first and 3 different examples of where honour codes changed. So we have Chinese foot binding, a practice that obviously became less acceptable. We have slavery and how slavery was treated in Britain and their reaction to slavery, and we also have duelling in British and European aristocracy and how that became less acceptable. And then we also have a 4th section which is on a current honour code that the author believes needs to change, as it well does, and that is the honour killing of women in certain countries and why that needs to change, and how hopefully from studying the 3 examples he's given we can see how it might be changed through the changing of like sort of public perceptions of things. I mean, honour codes are very much audience-based code of conduct. It's about how society perceives something as acceptable, or a group perceives something as acceptable or not acceptable, and how through pressure you can change honour codes and unacceptable practices in different cultures, as has been done in the past, like slavery and foot binding. So really, really moving, powerful book, and also just really interesting history. And I think because it's split into different sections, it means that it never gets boring, because there's not too much of each historical period. It changes just when you might be getting sick of the study of one period, so I really enjoyed that. We then have a very poetical piece of prose which is actually based on a collection of poetry, and it is Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. This is based on Ted Hughes' Crow, which is a poetry collection that I also read this year, where each poem is told from the perspective of Crow, who's basically observing the history of the world and the mythology of the world, either from the outside or getting involved. It's very dark poetry. Crow is not a likeable character in these poems, and Max Porter has basically written a novel where a family has lost their mother. There's 2 sons and a father. They've lost their wife and their mother, and it's about them dealing with this grief and how Crow helps them deal with this grief. The father is a Ted Hughes scholar, and he's writing about the collection of poetry called Crow, and Crow becomes a very physical character in this book, but you can also see that physical character is very much just a metaphor for the father's studies. It becomes a small family's event, and how Crow becomes a part of it. It's a wonderful story, and you can definitely read it by itself, but I'd also highly recommend reading Crow, because I think it'll give you a whole other understanding of this, either after or before. It's such an incredibly emotional book. It had me in tears, and it's not even very long. It's just over 100 pages. I would recommend this to everybody, especially if you don't read a lot of poetry or can't get into poetry, because it's such a poetical piece of prose. I think it might be a good entryway into beginning poetry reading. But for actual poetry, I do have a poetry collection. Now, this is like the first book I read this year, and I knew as soon as I read it, it was going to be in my favourite books of the year, and that is Hold Your Own by Kate Tempest. Oh, this book is perfection. I adored this collection. It starts off with one long poem, and then it's a series of shorter poems split into sections, and it is based on the Greek myth of Tiresias, who was a prophet that lived both as a man and a woman in different periods, having been changed by the gods. But it takes these themes of gender, the changeability of gender, gender identity, sex, family, love, and places them in a modern setting. These poems are incredible, and some of them had me in tears. In particular, one poem which was about a soldier and what war does to men and women that fight in it. Yeah, about hating war but not the soldiers. Oh, it's called Ballad of a Hero, and it was originally published as war music. I will actually link a performance of Kate Tempest performing that poem, because she is a performance poet, down below, because there is a YouTube video of that. So, highly recommend. One book I do want to mention as well, though, that I don't have a physical copy of, is The Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne. I had no idea A.A. Milne had written an adult book, but he did. He is the author of Winnie the Pooh, and he did write an adult book, and it is a detective mystery, and it is such a good detective mystery. It's so much fun. It was very witty, and I do find A.A. Milne's writing very witty even in Winnie the Pooh. And this one is very much in the style of Agatha Christie's books, if you like her books, and makes a lot of references to Sherlock Holmes, if you're a fan of Sherlock Holmes. It's a lot of good fun, and I just think it was, yeah, the perfect book for any, especially old-fashioned detective fan. And I'm sure a lot of you won't know it existed like I didn't, so I'd highly recommend that one. And last, but certainly not least, is another non-fiction book, and this is a bit of an autobiography, and it is Amanda Palmer's The Art of Asking. I am Amanda Palmer's new biggest fan. I adore her. I didn't know terribly much about Amanda Palmer before now. I hadn't actually really heard any of her music, although I've since been listening to it. But this book had a massive impact on me. It was a really wonderful book, although it wasn't a perfect book, and I think never can an autobiography or a book that kind of teaches you lessons be perfect, because you kind of had to take what works for you from it and leave what doesn't work for you from it. But it was an amazing story. Basically the story of Amanda Palmer's life, an encouraging book about creativity and asking for help, and I think would apply to almost anybody. You can find a situation where the messages and the stories in this book will apply to you and be helpful. It is amazing, and I started reading this book, ended up downloading the audiobook because it is read by Amanda Palmer herself, and at the end of each chapter there is the performance of a song or something like that by Amanda Palmer. So a whole new level of amazingness, and also nice to read along whilst you listen to. So I'd highly recommend the audiobook as well as the book of this. Although the book does also have pictures in it, which the audiobook doesn't obviously have, like this. And it also has song lyrics printed in it. Amanda Palmer is a sort of indie rock musician. If you haven't heard of her, she is phenomenal. Like, genuinely, I adore this woman, and I think so many of you will get something from this. I never consider myself a reader of self-help books, or I wouldn't call this a self-help book, but I could see that some people might perceive it as that. And if you're not really into those kind of books, don't let that put you off this, because I'm not either. This book is so much more than that. I never would have picked this up if my friends hadn't recommended it to me, and I am so glad they did. I need to do a whole video on it, which I will do at some point. but I would recommend this to 99% of you. But those are all of the books I want to talk about this year. I have read some amazing books. Some other books this year have been phenomenal as well, but you know, there's a point where you have to stop, really. So these are the top 15. I probably will link a few honourable mentions in the description box as well. So if you take a look down there, there will be a few other books that I would recommend you read because I really enjoyed them this year. But there was not enough space in this video. It's currently half an hour long. I'm going to try and edit it down to at least 20 minutes or less. So I'm going to go and do that now. Please do let me know your favourite book of the year. Comments down below. I'd love to hear from you about them. And yeah, I'm going to go because this video is so long. Here's to another fantastic reading year in 2016, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!